us. Some of you joining us, as we know, through the various Vatican media channels, the Vatican Audio Live Events app or the Radio Vaticana app, our Vatican News English web portal, YouTube channel, or Facebook Live feed. To those of you joining through television, I'd like to welcome all of you joining us through Catholic TV, Catholic Faith Network, Shalom World Television Networks USA, EWTN, Salt and Light Media, at Medarshan TV, and to all of you joining us through other radio stations, diocesan or local, or our own shortwave radio broadcast, and especially to all listeners tuning in through other digital platforms. We see our Holy Father now walking, making his way down the aisle, followed by the Cardinal Secretary of State, Cardinal Pietro Parolin, the substitute, Archbishop Peña-Parra, and the Secretary for Relations with States, Paul Richard Gallagher. Now, the Aula delle Benedizione, or the Hall of Blessing, was built by Pope Paul V, the Borghese Pope. We're in the 17th century, and it was the work of the architect Carlo Moderno. Moderno was the architect of the Fabbrica di San Pietro for 26 years. And this is in the facade of St. Peter's. It stands on its own foundations and is divided into two parts, which was built between 1608 and 1614. In the lower order, our Holy Father now greeting the Dean of the Diplomatic Corps here. We'll be hearing from him shortly. The lower part of the facade is the entrance to St. Peter's with the famous gates. And there are 9 windows on this area, 3 of which have balconies. The central one, of course, is the one on which the popes come out the first time they are made a pope, and for the Urbi et Orbi blessings. The hall was completed between 1611 and 1612. It has recently undergone restoration, especially to the stucco on the vault. Water damage needed to be repaired. Now we hear from the Dean. His Excellency Mr. George Poulides, the Ambassador of Cyprus, Your Holiness. As Dean of the Diplomatic Corps, I once again have the honor to express to you our best wishes for your good health and for the successful continuation of your apostolic mission. Allow me to express our joy at being able to have this traditional moment of encounter, which fills our hearts with hope and shows the world in a symbolic way the representatives of states gathered around the Holy Father.
Les plus sincères condoléances du corps diplomatique.
On behalf of the Diplomatic Corps and on my own behalf, I wish to extend deepest condolences to Your Holiness and to the Holy See on the death of the Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI. We all remember him with esteem and affection, not only for his dedication to the Church and his profound culture, but also for his gentleness and availability, also to us diplomats. Moreover, during the 8 years of his pontificate, Benedict XVI carried out an impressive amount of pastoral and teaching work. He also visited many of our countries. During these same days last year, we were looking forward to a return to normality in 2022 after 2 years marked by the health emergency caused by the outbreak of COVID-19 and the great suffering it caused the world. At the end of the most acute phase of the crisis, we were ready to rebuild our suspended lives and heal the wounds.
La réalité de la nouvelle année a été un autre terrible virus, celui
The
de
new
la
year was instead marked by another terrible virus, namely the virus of war,
se propager
which,
comme une nouvelle
far from being eradicated,
comme malheureusement
seems to spread
entraîner le monde
like a new pandemic which unfortunately threatens
l'avez dit,
to engulf the whole world.
organisé hors d'une rencontre interreligieuse promue par la communauté de Sant'Egidio en octobre 2022.
As you said at the Colosseum last October, at the interreligious meeting sponsored by the St. Egidio community,
Aujourd'hui, la paix est gravement
this year our prayer has become a heartfelt plea. Because today, peace has been gravely violated, assaulted, and trampled on.
que vous avez adressée
With this sad observation in my heart, I would like to recall today the prayer you addressed to the Blessed Virgin Mary
une prière qui m'a touché
at the act of veneration on 8 December last.
de l'exhortation adressée
It was
à
a prayer that touched me for the intensity and force of the exhortation directed to Our Lady.
Puissions-nous continuer
Turning towards you, and this is a quote, turning towards you who are without sin, may we continue to believe and hope that love will overcome hatred, truth will overcome lives,
que la paix
forgiveness will overcome offense, peace will overcome war. End of quote.
vous avez prononcé ces paroles et votre émotion
In the sorrow and emotion with which you spoke these words, we saw
la souffrance
with our own eyes the suffering of humanity affected by the tragedy of conflicts and the violence, pain, and destruction which accompany them.
des pères et des mères qui pleurent la mort de leurs enfants, des jeunes qui deviennent
The fathers and mothers who mourn the deaths of their
des
children,
maisons détruites,
young people who have become untimely orphans,
et des
homes destroyed, lands devastated, exiles, and refugees.
traversé nos esprits pendant votre
These
prière.
images which crossed our minds during your prayer mark our mission as diplomats.
Et courage nos actions qui visent
The words you spoke encourage us in our efforts to defuse the causes of conflicts and ensure that they do not break out and destroy the good found in every society.
la victoire de la paix ne peut être obtenue que par la capacité de chacun à se sentir membre de la famille humaine.
Peace can achieve victory only if everyone sees him or herself as part of the human family. Only through listening, dialogue, acceptance, and welcome of others, the weak and the marginalized, is it possible to build the culture of peace, of which the world today seems to have great need.
Les chemins que vous avez tracés au cours de l'année écoulée, l'effort, y compris physique, que vous avez fourni
Retracing the paths trodden by you during this past year, Holy Father, the effort, including the physical effort, which you expended in order to remove oxygen from the fire of evil and indifference, appears evident. Today we are here to thank you for your example and your commitment.
que vous avez également illustré dans votre récent message pour la journée de la paix.
The challenges, which you set out also in the recent message for the World Day of Peace, are acknowledged by diplomacy in the belief that peace is vital not only for countries in crisis, but also for nations that directly or indirectly suffer the unfortunate consequences.
La pauvreté, les inégalités, l'accès à l'alimentation,
Among these challenges of increasing significance are poverty, inequality, access to food, public health, and decent work for all. And I quote, welcoming and integrating migrants and those whom our societies discard. End of quote.
Nous vous remercions, Saint-Père, pour les exemples à suivre que vous nous avez offerts à travers vos voyages. À Malte, vous
We
avez
thank you, Holy Father, for the examples you give us to follow through your journeys. In Malta, you drew attention to the theme of welcoming and fraternity. you recalled that the Phoenician meaning of the name of the island is safe harbor, and that a common approach to the theme of immigration is fundamental.
Vous avez parlé d'une Méditerranée qui a besoin de co-responsabilité.
You spoke of a Mediterranean that needs co-responsibility in order to become a new theater of solidarity. Allow me to borrow your words, to summarize in one sentence the complexity of the phenomenon of migration and the great responsibility we all bear to build a more supportive and peaceful society. And he quotes from the meeting with the authorities and the diplomatic corps on April 2, 2022. Other people are not a virus from which we need to be protected, but persons to be accepted. In your penitential pilgrimage to Canada, you continued the journey of healing and reconciliation with the Indigenous peoples. You demonstrated solidarity with peoples on the peripheries, and you reaffirmed the Holy See's commitment to caring for creation. Your Holiness, you have indicated to us that listening and understanding are the basis for ecumenism and dialogue between religions. At the 7th Congress of Leaders of World and Traditional Religions in Kazakhstan, you emphasized that among the basic rights of a multi-ethnic and multicultural society, religious freedom represents the best channel for civil coexistence.
Très Saint-Père, je vous remercie de nous avoir rappelé que la capacité de se retrouver et de se rencontrer dans le
Holy Father, I thank you for having reminded us that the ability to come together and meet one another while respecting the freedom and duties of each person is basic to a society where people live in harmony.
Forum for Dialogue, East and West for Human Coexistence, vous avez invité une fois de plus à reconnaître.
In Bahrain, Your Holiness took part in the Forum for Dialogue, East and West for Human Coexistence, where you repeated your invitation to recognize what we intrinsically have in common, while maintaining our particularities and diversity. In the spirit of the encyclical Fratelli Tutti, and continuing on the path taken in the document on human fraternity for world peace and living together, which you and the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar, Ahmed Al-Tayeb, signed in Abu Dhabi on the 4th of February 2019, you reminded us, Holy Father, that unity is not sameness, no, it is unity in diversity. In a word, the Holy Spirit does not imprison us in uniformity, but disposes us to accept one another in our differences. Holy Father, as I approach my conclusion, permit me to mention another journey. This time not a geographical one, but one that is internal to the Holy See, a journey that is not directed to what was, but to what will be. Allow me to recall the importance of the completion of the ecclesial and synodal process of the Apostolic Constitution Predicate Evangelium on the Roman Curia and its service to the Church in the world. This is a profound reform that marks your pontificate and, as you wrote, serves to favor a more effective evangelization, to promote a more fruitful ecumenical spirit, to encourage a more constructive dialogue with all.
Comme vous nous avez rappelé dans le message Urbi et Orbi du matin de Noël,
as you reminded us in the Urbi et Orbi message on Christmas morning, quote, our time is experiencing a grave famine of peace, unquote.
Qui ne peut pas être parcouru seul.
We know that the path to peace is a winding one that is not undertaken alone. Our thoughts turn to the many places where the piecemeal Third World War is being waged, and where peace struggles to make its voice heard. There are places for which on Christmas morning you ask that weapons might be silenced. We know, however, that peace requires courage and truth. Holy Father, I greet you and thank you on behalf of the diplomatic family, accredited to the Holy See, which I have the honor of representing as Dean. I hope you have an excellent journey when in the near future you undertake your pilgrimage of peace and reconciliation to the Democratic Republic of Congo and to South Sudan, on the continent of Africa, the cradle of humanity.
Inlassable, espoir pour tant de peuples, tant d'hommes et de femmes de toute latitude.
And he concludes, thank you, Holy Father, for your untiring work, which gives hope to many peoples, men and women of all latitudes. His Excellency, Mr. George Poulides, the Ambassador of Cyprus, accredited to the Holy See. Now, in greeting Pope Francis, shaking hands here. And we now will hear the words of our Holy Father on this occasion when he meets with the members of the Diplomatic Corps. This is an annual meeting, always taking place just after New Year. And we see many of the ambassadors here who have come on this occasion.
Eminenza, Eccellenze, Signore,
Your Eminences, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for your presence at our customary meeting, which this year we would like to be a call for peace in a world that is witnessing heightened divisions and wars. I am grateful, in particular, to the Dean of the Diplomatic Corps, His Excellency Mr. George Poulides, for the good wishes that he extended to me in the name of you all. My greeting goes to each one of you, to your families, your co-workers, and to the peoples and governments of the countries you represent. To all of you and to the authorities of your countries, I am likewise grateful for the messages of condolence sent for the death of Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI and for the closeness shown during his funeral. We have just ended the Christmas season in which Christians commemorate the mystery of the birth of the Son of God. The prophet Isaiah had foretold that birth in these words, "A child has been born for us, a son given to us. Authority rests upon his shoulders, and he is named Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace." Your presence is a sign of the importance of the peace and human fraternity that dialogue helps to build. The task of diplomacy is precisely to resolve conflicts and thus to foster a climate of reciprocal cooperation and trust for the sake of meeting common needs. It can be said that diplomacy is an exercise of humility, since it demands that we sacrifice something of our self-regard in order to build a relationship with others, to understand their way of thinking and points of view, and thus to oppose human pride and arrogance that are the cause of every will to wage war. I am grateful for the consideration shown by your countries to the Holy See, marked in this past year not least by the decisions of Switzerland, the Republic of the Congo, Mozambique, and Azerbaijan to appoint resident ambassadors in Rome, as well as by the signing of new bilateral accords with the Democratic Republic of São Tomé and Principe and with the Republic of Kazakhstan. Here I would like to mention that in the context of a respectful and constructive dialogue, the Holy See and the People's Republic of China have agreed to extend for another 2-year period the validity of the provisional agreement regarding the appointment of bishops stipulated in Beijing in 2018. It is my hope that this collaborative relationship can increase for the benefit of the life of the Catholic Church and that of the Chinese people. At this meeting, I would also assure you once more of the full cooperation of the Secretariat of State and the dicasteries of the Roman Curia. With the promulgation of the new Apostolic Constitution, Predicate Evangelium, the Curia has been reorganized in some of its structures so that it can carry out its work with evangelical spirit, working for the good and service of communion, unity, and the building up of the universal Church, while always attentive to the circumstances of the world in which the Church is called to carry out its mission. Dear ambassadors, this year marks the 60th anniversary of the encyclical Pacem in Terris of St. John the 23rd, issued less than 2 months before his death. Very much present in the mind of the good Pope was the threat of nuclear war raised in October 1962 by the so-called Cuban Missile Crisis. Humanity would have been only a step away from its own annihilation had it not proved possible to make dialogue prevail in recognition of the devastating effects of atomic weapons. Sadly, today too, the nuclear threat is raised, and the world once more feels fear and anguish. Here I can only reaffirm that the possession of atomic initiating the appalling slaughter and destruction that war would bring in its wake, there is no denying that the conflagration could be started by some chance and unforeseen circumstance. End of quote. From this standpoint, particular concern is raised by the stall in the negotiations for the resumption of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, better known as the Iran nuclear deal. It is my hope that a concrete solution can be reached as quickly as possible for the sake of ensuring a more secure future. Today, the Third World War is taking place in a globalized world where conflicts involve only certain areas of the planet directly involve all of them. The closest and most recent example is certainly the war in Ukraine, with its wake of death and destruction, with its attacks on civil infrastructures that cause lives to be lost, not only from gunfire and acts of violence, but also from hunger and freezing cold. For its part, the Conciliar Constitution, Gaudium et Spes, states that every act of war directed to the indiscriminate destruction of whole cities or vast areas with their inhabitants is a crime against God and humanity, which merits firm and unequivocal condemnation. Nor can we forget that war practically affects those who are most fragile, children, the elderly, the disabled, and leaves an indelible mark on families. Today I feel bound to renew my appeal for an immediate end to this senseless conflict, whose effects are felt in entire regions also outside of Europe, due to its repercussions in the area of energy and food production, above all in Africa and in the Middle East. The present Third World War, fought piecemeal, also makes us consider other theaters of tension and conflict. Once more this year, with immense sorrow, we must look to the war-torn land of Syria. The rebirth of that country must come about through needed reforms, including constitutional, in an effort to give hope to the Syrian people, affected by growing poverty, while at the same time ensuring that the international sanctions imposed do not affect the daily life of a people that has already suffered so much.
La Santa Sede segue anche con preoccupazione l'aumento della violenza tra I palestinesi e israeliani.
The Holy See also follows with concern the increase of violence between Palestinians and Israelis, sadly resulting in a number of victims and complete mutual distrust. Jerusalem, a holy city for Jews, Christians, and Muslims, is particularly affected by this. The name Jerusalem evokes its vocation to be a city of peace, but sadly it has become a theater of conflict. I trust that it can rediscover this vocation to be a location and a symbol of encounter and peaceful coexistence, and that access and liberty of worship in the holy places will continue to be guaranteed and respected in accordance with the status quo. At the same time, I express my hope that the authorities of the State of Israel and those of the State of Palestine can recover the courage and determination to dialogue directly for the sake of implementing the two-state solution in all its aspects, in conformity with international law and all the pertinent resolutions of the United Nations. As you know, at the end of the month, I will at last be able to go as a pilgrim of peace to the Democratic Republic of the Congo, in the hope that violence will cease in the east of the country, and that the path of dialogue and the will to work for security and the common good will prevail. My pilgrimage will continue in South Sudan, where I will be accompanied by the Archbishop of Canterbury and by the General Moderator of the Presbyterian Church of Scotland. Together we desire to unite ourselves to the plea for peace by the country's people, and thus contribute to the process of national reconciliation. Nor must we forget other situations still burdened by the effects of still unresolved conflicts. I think in particular of the situation in the South Caucasus. I urge the parties to respect the ceasefire, and I reiterate that the liberation of military and civil prisoners would prove to be an important step towards a much-desired peace agreement. I think too of Yemen, where the last October's truce holds, yet many civilians continue to die because of mines, and of Ethiopia, where I trust that the peace process will continue and the international community will reaffirm its commitment to respond to the humanitarian crisis experienced by that country. I also follow with deep concern the situation in West Africa, increasingly plagued by acts of terrorist violence. I think in particular of the tragic situations endured by the populations of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Nigeria, and I express my hope that the processes of transition underway in Sudan, Mali, Chad, Guinea, and Burkina Faso will take place in respect for the legitimate aspirations of the populations involved.
La situazione del Myanmar, che ormai da 2 anni sperimenta violenza, dolore e morte.
I am particularly attentive to the situation of Myanmar, which for 2 years now has experienced violence, suffering, and death. I invite the international community to work to concretize the processes of reconciliation, and I urge all the parties involved to undertake anew the path of dialogue in order to restore hope to the people of that beloved land. Finally, I think of the Korean Peninsula, and I express my hope that the goodwill and commitment to concord will not diminish for the sake of achieving the greatly desired peace and prosperity for the entire Korean people. All conflicts nonetheless bring to the fore the lethal consequences of a continual recourse to the production of new and ever more sophisticated weaponry, which is sometimes justified by the argument that, and he quotes, peace cannot be assured except by the basis of an equal balance of armaments. And he concludes the quote. There is a need to change this way of thinking and move towards an integral disarmament, since no peace is possible where instruments of death are proliferating.
Cari ambasciatori, in un tempo così conflittuale non possiamo eludere la domanda su come.
Dear ambassadors, at a time of such great conflict, we cannot avoid wondering about how we can weave anew the threads of peace. Where do we begin? To sketch a response, I would like to take up with you some elements of Pacem in Terris, a text that continues to be extremely timely, even though the international context has changed greatly. St. John the 23rd was convinced that peace is possible in respect for four fundamental goods: truth, justice, solidarity, and freedom. These serve as the pillars that regulate relationships between individuals and political communities alike. These dimensions intersect in the fundamental premise that each human being is a person, possessed of a nature, endowed with intelligence and free will. And as such, he or she has rights and duties which together flow as a direct consequence of his or her own nature. These rights and duties are universal and inviolable, and therefore altogether inalienable. Peace in truth. To build peace in truth means, above all, to respect the human person with his or her right to life and to physical integrity, and guaranteeing his or her freedom in investigating the truth and to freedom of speech and publication. This requires civil authorities to make a positive contribution to the creation of an overall climate in which individuals can both safeguard their own rights and fulfill their duties, and can do so readily. Fulfill their duties and can do so readily. Despite the commitments undertaken by all states to respect human rights and the fundamental freedoms of each person, even today, in many countries, women are considered second-class citizens. They are subject to violence and abuse and are denied the opportunity to study, work, employ their talents, have access to health care, and even to food. Whereas, when human rights are fully recognized for all, women can offer their unique contribution to the life of society and to be the first allies of peace. Peace requires, before all else, the defense of life, a good that today is jeopardized not only by conflicts, hunger, and disease, but all too often even in the mother's womb, through the promotion of an alleged right to abortion. No one, however, can claim rights over the life of another human being, especially one who is powerless and thus has absolutely no recourse to defend him or herself. For this reason, I appeal to the consciences of men and women of goodwill, particularly those having political responsibilities, to strive to safeguard the rights of those who are weakest, and to combat the throwaway culture that also tragically affects the sick, the disabled, and the elderly. States have a primary responsibility to ensure that citizens are assisted in every phase of human life until natural death, and to do so in a way that makes each feel accompanied and cared for, even in the most delicate moments of life. The right to life is also threatened in those places where the death penalty continues to be imposed, as is the case in these days in Iran, following the recent demonstrations demanding greater respect for the dignity of women. The death penalty cannot be employed for a purported state justice, since it does not constitute a deterrent nor render justice to victims, but only fuels the thirst for vengeance. I appeal then for an end to the death penalty, which is always inadmissible, since it attacks the inviolability and the dignity of the person. In the legislation of all the countries of the world, I ask that it be revoked. We cannot overlook the fact that up until his or her very last moment, a person can repent and change. Tragically, we increasingly witness the emergence of a fear of life, which translates in many places into a fear of the future and a difficulty in creating families and bringing children into life. In some contexts, I think, for example, of Italy, where there is a dangerous fall in the birth rate, a veritable demographic winter, which endangers the very future of society. I wish once more to encourage the beloved Italian people to confront with tenacity and hope the challenges of the present time by drawing strength from their religious and cultural roots. Fears are fueled by ignorance and prejudice and thus easily degenerate into conflicts. Education is the antidote to this. The Holy See promotes an integral vision of education in which the cultivation of religious values is able to keep pace with scientific knowledge and continually advancing technical progress. The work of education always requires showing integral respect for the person and for his or her natural physiognomy, and avoiding the imposition of a novel and confused vision of the human being. This entails integrating the processes of human, spiritual, intellectual, and professional growth, thus enabling the person to be set free from multiple forms of enslavement and, in freedom and responsibility, to take his or her place in society. Education is prey to a crisis made even more acute by the devastating effects of the pandemic and by the troubling geopolitical scenario. In this regard, the Transforming Education Summit, convened by the General Secretary of the United Nations, which met in New York last September, provided governments with a unique opportunity to adopt courageous policies aimed at confronting the present educational catastrophe and to enact concrete decisions to achieve quality instruction for everyone by 2030. May states find the courage to reverse the embarrassing and disproportionate relationship between public funding for education and expenditures on armaments. Peace also calls for the universal recognition of religious freedom. It is troubling that people are being persecuted simply because they publicly profess their faith, and in many countries, religious freedom is limited. About a third of the world's population lives under these conditions.
Non posso non menzionare come alcune statistiche dimostrano.
Along with the lack of religious freedom, there is also persecution for religious reasons. I cannot fail to mention, as certain statistics have shown, that 1 out of every 7 Christians experiences persecution. Here I express my hope that the new special envoy of the European Union for the promotion of freedom of religion or belief outside the EU will be able to dispose of the resources and means necessary to carry out his specific mandate in an appropriate way. At the same time, we should not overlook the fact that violence and acts of discrimination against Christians are also increasing in countries where the latter are not a minority. Religious freedom is also endangered wherever believers see their ability to express their convictions in the life of society restricted in the name of misguided understanding of inclusiveness. Religious freedom, which cannot be reduced simply to freedom of worship, is one of the minimum requisites for a dignified way of life. Governments have the duty to protect this right and to ensure that each person, in a way compatible with the common good, enjoys the opportunity to act in accordance with his or her own conscience, also in the public sphere and in the exercise of their profession. Religion provides genuine opportunities for dialogue and encounter between different peoples and cultures. The Timor-Leste Parliament bore witness to this in its unanimous decision to approve the document on human fraternity that I signed with the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar in 2019, and by including the document in the programs of the nation's educational and cultural institutions. I was able to experience this personally during my visit to Kazakhstan last September on the occasion of the 7th Congress of Leaders of World and Traditional Religions, with whom I shared a number of concerns about today's world and saw firsthand that religions are not a problem but part of the solution for a more harmonious life in society. Equally significant was my visit to Bahrain, where a further step forward was taken in the journey of Muslim and Christian believers. Attempts are often made to blame religion for the various conflicts within our human family, and deplorable efforts are sometimes made to exploit religion for purely political ends. This runs counter to the Christian understanding, which sees the root of every conflict in an imbalance present in the human heart. In the words of the gospel, from within, out of the heart of man, come evil thoughts. Christianity is a force for peace, since it encourages conversion and the exercise of virtue. Peace in justice. Building peace requires pursuing justice. The 1962 crisis was averted thanks to the contribution of men and women of goodwill who were able to devise suitable solutions that prevented political tension from degenerating into an actual war. It was also due to the conviction that disputes could be resolved within the framework of international law and through those organizations, principally the United Nations, that were established in the aftermath of the Second World War and encouraged multilateral diplomacy. In the words of St. John the 23rd, the United Nations organization has the specific aim of maintaining and strengthening peace between nations and of encouraging and assisting friendly relations between them. Based on the principles of equality, mutual respect, and extensive cooperation in every field of human endeavor. The current conflict in Ukraine has made all the more evident the crisis that has long affected the multilateral systems, which needs a profound rethinking of it if it is to respond adequately to the challenges of our times. This demands a reform of the bodies that allow it to function effectively, so that they can be truly representative of the needs and sensitivities of all peoples, and avoid procedures that give greater weight to some to the detriment of others. It is not a matter of creating coalitions, but of providing opportunities for everyone to be partners in dialogue. Great good can be achieved by working together. We need only think of the praiseworthy initiatives that aim at reducing poverty, assisting migrants, combating climate change, promoting nuclear disarmament, and providing humanitarian aid. Yet in recent times, the various international forums have seen an increase in polarization and attempts to impose a single way of thinking which hinders dialogue and marginalizes those who see things differently. There is the risk of drifting into what more and more appears as an ideological totalitarianism that promotes intolerance towards those who dissent from certain positions, claim to represent progress, but in fact would appear to lead to an overall regression of humanity, with the violation of freedom of thought and freedom of conscience. In addition, more and more resources have been spent on imposing forms of ideological colonization, especially on poorer countries, and directly connecting the provision of economic aid to the acceptance of such ideologies. This has strained debate within international organizations, precluding fruitful exchanges and often leading to the temptation to address issues independently and consequently on the basis of power relations. During my visit to Canada last July, I was able to experience firsthand the consequences of colonization, especially in my meetings with the indigenous peoples who suffered from the assimilation policies of the past. Attempts made to impose alien ways of thinking upon other cultures open the way to sharp confrontation and at times even violence. It's necessary to return to dialogue, fostering shared responsibility and cooperation in the pursuit of the common good. Efforts to preclude or veto discussion in the name of solidarity, born of the consequences that we are responsible for the fragility of others as we strive to build a common future. Efforts to preclude or veto discussion will only fuel further divisions. And finally, peace and solidarity. In my annual message for the World Day of Peace, I noted how COVID-19 pandemic has left in its wake the realization that we all need one another. The paths of peace are paths of solidarity, because no one can be saved alone. We live in a world so interconnected that in the end the actions of each have consequences for everyone. Here I wish to draw attention to three areas in which these interconnection uniting today's human family is particularly felt, and where greater solidarity is especially needed. The first area is that of migration, which concerns entire regions of the world. Often it is an issue of individuals fleeing from war and persecution and who face immense dangers. Then, too, every human being has the right to freedom of movement, to emigrate to other countries that take up residence there. And everyone should have the possibility of returning to his or her own country. Migration is one issue where we cannot move ahead at random. To understand this, we need but look at the Mediterranean, which has become a massive tomb. Those lost lives are emblematic of the shipwreck of civilization, As I'd noted during my trip to Malta last spring, in Europe, there is a pressing need to reinforce the regulatory framework through the approval of the new Pact on Migration and Asylum, so as to put in place suitable policies for welcoming, accompanying, promoting, and integrating migrants. At the same time, solidarity requires that the burden of the operations needed to aid and care for the shipwrecked does not fall entirely on the people of the main landing points. The second area concerns the economy and work. The crises of recent years have highlighted the limits of an economic system aimed more at creating profit for a few than at providing opportunities for the benefit of the many, an economy more focused on money than on the production of useful goods. This has created more fragile businesses and unjust labor markets. There is a need to restore dignity to business and to work, combating all forms of exploitation that ends up treating workers as a commodity, for without dignified work and just remuneration, young people will not truly become adults, and inequality will increase. The third area is the care for our common home. We are continually witnessing the results of climate change and their serious effects on the lives of entire peoples, either by the devastation they produce, as in the case of Pakistan in the areas that experienced flooding, where outbreaks of disease borne by stagnant water continue to increase, or in vast areas of the Pacific Ocean, where global warming has caused great damage to fishing, which is the basis of daily life for entire populations, or in Somalia and the entire Horn of Africa, where drought is causing severe famine, and in recent days too in the United States, where sudden and intense blizzard conditions caused numerous deaths. Last summer, the Holy See chose to accede to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change as a means of lending its moral support to the efforts of all states to cooperate in accordance with their responsibilities and respective capabilities in offering an effective and appropriate response to the challenges posed by climate change. It is hoped that the steps taken at COP27 with the adoption of the Sharm el-Sheikh implementation plan, however limited, can raise everyone's awareness of an urgent issue that can no longer be ignored. Promising goals, however, were agreed upon during the recent United Nations Biodiversity Conference held in Montreal last month. Peace and freedom. Finally, peace building requires that there be no place for violence, for violation of the freedom, integrity, and security of other nations, no matter what may be their territorial extension or their capacity for defense. This can come about only if in every single community there does not prevail that culture of oppression and aggression in which our neighbor is regarded as an enemy to be attacked, rather than a brother or sister to welcome and embrace. It is a source of concern that in many parts of the world there is a weakening of democracy and of the breadth of freedom that it enables, albeit with all the limitations of any human system. It is often women or ethnic minorities who often pay the price for this, as too do entire societies in which unrest leads to social tensions and even armed clashes. In many areas, a sign of the weakening of democracy is heightened political and social polarization, which does not help to resolve the urgent problems of citizens. I think of the various countries of the Americas, where political crises are laden with tensions and forms of violence that exacerbate social conflicts. In particular, I would mention recent events in Peru and in the recent hours in Brazil, and the worrying situation in Haiti, where steps are finally being taken to address the political crisis that has been underway for some time. There is a constant need to overcome partisan ways of thinking and to work for the promotion of the common good. I have also followed closely the situation in Lebanon, which is still awaiting the election of a new president of the Republic. I hope that the political leaders will make every effort to enable the country to recover from the dramatic economic and social situation it is presently experiencing. Dear Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, how wonderful it would be if just once we were able to gather simply to thank the Lord Almighty for His constant blessings, without having to list all the tragic events plaguing our world. If I may quote once more the words of John the 23rd, we nonetheless remain hopeful that by establishing contact with one another and by a policy of negotiation, nations will come to a better recognition of the natural ties that bind them together as men and women. We are hopeful, too, that they will come to a fairer realization of one of the cardinal duties deriving from our common nature, namely that love, not fear, must dominate the relationships between individuals and between nations. And he concludes, it is principally characteristic of love that it draws men and women together in all sorts of ways, sincerely united in the bonds of mind and matter. And this is a union from which countless blessings can flow. With these sentiments I renew to you and to the countries you represent my heartfelt good wishes for a new year. Thank you. The Holy See has been exchanging ambassadors since the 15th century, and that diplomacy slowly waned in the 17th century after the time of Napoleon. Although in the same period, around 1805, Prussia became the first Protestant state to send an ambassador to Rome. And then with the extinction of the Papal States in 1870 and the consequent loss of territorial sovereignty, it declined even more. However, at that time, such major powers as Russia, Prussia, and Austria-Hungary continued to maintain diplomatic relations. And it was after the First World War that the exchange of ambassadors became increasingly common. And for the first time since relations were broken between the Pope and Queen Elizabeth of England, a British diplomatic mission to the Holy See opened in 1914. And the number has steadily grown. Today, there are 183 states that currently maintain diplomatic relations with the Holy See. And there are other entities, such as the European Union and the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, that have diplomatic sees with the Holy See. There are currently 91 embassy chancelleries accredited to the Holy See with headquarters in Rome, including those of the European Union and the Sovereign Military Order of Malta. We heard others newly created, which our Holy Father mentioned in his speech. Our Holy Father now greeting the different ambassadors here present. He will continue greeting each of the ambassadors here present. And with these images, we now bring this live broadcast of the greetings of Pope Francis to the diplomatic corps in the new year 2023 to an end. We invite you to visit the Vatican News web portal, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube accounts for coverage of today's discourse, as well as other Vatican and world news. And we'll be back on Wednesday with the weekly general audience with Pope Francis that begins around 9 o'clock. That's local Rome time. On behalf of Vatican Media, I'd like to thank all of our media partners who have brought this broadcast to you: Catholic TV, Catholic Faith Network, Shalom World Television Networks USA, EWTN, Salt and Light Media, at Madarshan TV, and to our in-studio technicians who've made this broadcast possible, especially to our in-studio audio technician, Patrizio Ciprari, and our audio coordinator, Alessandro De Carolis. Once again, on behalf of Vatican Media, thank you so much for joining us today. We look forward to having you joining us in the near future. Laudetur Jesus Christus. Praised be Jesus Christ.